So now that we've gone through the tree building tab, we can move on to the browser tab. And the browser screen is where we can navigate the tree and look at the output of our solution. And while this tab looks incredibly simple, there's a massive amount of data stored within this interface. And we can select a variety of options within this interface to display different levels of aggregation of this data to answer different questions. If you think back to the first module, and when I talked about the varying levels of context from range down to hand class, down to hand, down to combo, that all happens here within this browser tab. So we're going to explore a lot of that as we go through this screen, which again seemingly looks very simple, but packs a lot of information into this screen. So we'll start here just by looking here at the top left of the screen, and that's really just going to give us some information about the current node of the tree. First, we can see if it's the out of players or the in position players decision. So, right now we are on the root. If we actually, and it's the out of position player's decision. If we check, we can see that this will change here for the in position player's decision. If we reach the end of a street, so if we check both of these, if both players check, then we'll see that this turns into what's referred to as a split node, in which case it's the end of the street and we have to select a card and move on to the next street. Below this line, there's some syntax here. It's PO-specific syntax that denotes the node, and R is going to refer to the root node, and from there actions are separated by colons. Bets are always a cumulative amount of the money that's invested by a player so far. And then there are various letters that happen here to denote what has already happened within the hand and giving us a little bit of information as to where we are in the game tree. So C stands for a check or a call, B stands for a bet or a raise, always to the cumulative amount. And cards or full flops are written as they are in the tree. So again, we can see here, we click on the roots and we're at this R0. If we bet 28, you'll see that this is separated by a colon here, and we have this B and then 28. If there's a raise to 77, you'll see another B, and this cumulative amount goes to 77. And then when you see something like a call, you'll see a C for a call. I can even put another card out here, and you'll actually see the card, which is written as they are written in the tree. So, this is really just a PO-specific syntax way of writing in text information about where we are in this particular game tree. Our board is displayed here, and we actually have this cool button here that lets us load another board in the same folder. So I could click this and open up all of the boards within the same folder. I actually have this specific scenario where I ran all 1,755 boards for this situation at 100 big blinds. So I could actually filter down through this entire folder and look at any flop that I have within that folder and switch over to that example. So let's say instead, I'm done looking at this King 9-5 board and I want to look at an Ace 9-7 monotone board. I could click on that and it would open up this board. I could also filter this by any quick filters, maybe filtering by I only want to look at things with paired boards, and I only want to look at suited paired boards. Well, by doing that, by clicking these checkboxes, it's going to filter down to the 156 of the 1,755 flops that meets the criteria that I noted here. And finally, I could also filter by some of these other various elements here, filtering by the highest card, the middle card, or the bottom card here too. So there's a lot of different ways in which I can actually load other files within the same folders. Again, I find this fairly useful, particularly when you have a lot of boards within the similar types of solves, so the same formation solved over a lot of different boards within that same folder. This is a really good way to navigate through to each of those types of boards. And then finally down here, there's some text, which is essentially just some information on things like the pot size, how we got to where we are. So there's some information about the bet information here, and just the various factors that contribute to the overall starting pot and effective stacks that are used for these calculations. Next, we move to the navigator here, and the navigator is fairly simple in its functionality. As we saw in Module 1, a poker hand is made up of an extremely large number of nodes, and at each decision point, we're only looking at one of a large number of those nodes. And this is really just a simple way to let us navigate through the game tree. The node that we're currently on is going to be highlighted in yellow by default, and you'll see the strategic choices that at the current decision point by one of those two players. So in our example here, it's the out of position player's decision, and we can see that we're at the root, and the player can either check or bet 28, which is half pot. If we select either of those options, so I select check here, you'll automatically move to that node of the game tree, and we'll be presented with the next options on the game tree. And the rest of the options on the screen, which we'll get into in a minute, will also change to then display the corresponding information for the node that we've selected. And you can even see that here in the macro level data on the top right of the screen, where if I'm at the root, it shows me the macro level strategic frequencies for the root. But if I click check, now it shows the macro level strategic frequencies for the in position player here, for that in position player's response. And again, we'll get to that in a moment too, but I do want to just say that all of the data on this screen is going to represent the node that we've actually selected. If we reach the end of the node, so let's say we go check, check, all of this will kind of blank out because it's neither player's decision. This is where we're actually at that split node. And that just means we've reached the end of all of the possible decisions for that current street, and the solver needs to know the next card to determine the rest of the tree. Now, you can then select one of these cards here. Maybe I want to select here the 2 of clubs, and move on to the next part of the street. But I do want to, essentially re-emphasize as, we're going through here, how much data this truly is. Like, we can pick an example card here. So, go back to this and we can pick one of these cards, but there are 49 possible turn cards. There are 48 possible river cards before you account for any of the dead cards. And Pio has calculated complete solutions across all of these cards, whereas we're often only going to look at, one or maybe a few of them. So when you pick a card, you can move on to the next street and navigate it as much as you want until you reach the end of the tree. Now, you're not going to often find yourself in those situations where you're navigating super deep into the tree until the end, but the option is there. If you do want to go down that route, you can. So let's go back to the root node here. So finally, we'll go through this top right section, and let me actually move my head out of the way so we can actually walk through this here. So there's a few options here in the top right section. So first you have this box, which allows you to enter one specific combination, and that can help you see how frequencies can change versus that one combination. It allows you, so once you enter that one combination, maybe you want to see, maybe what your opponent had, or there were some dead cards, or you wanted to see how the knowledge of opponent's cards or opponent's combinations would change the overall frequencies of your range. You can enter that combination here and toggle the on button. So suppose I know my opponent might have ace of hearts, 6 of clubs, and I hit on. Well, and actually, let me go back to the root node in order to do so, and I can toggle on. You'll see in the frequency overview that numbers do change, and actually, let me toggle back on and off. You'll see that frequencies change, and actually, in this case, somewhat significantly. Frequencies actually don't change, but the combinations change in this situation here too. So our combinations here go down because really what the solver is actually doing here is removing any hands that contain the ace of hearts or 6 of clubs out of a particular range here in this spot. I think people often misunderstand what this actually does. It doesn't necessarily rechange the calculations. It doesn't necessarily solve how to optimize your range against that exact combination. I can demonstrate to you actually right now why that isn't the case, right? So, if we enter, let's just change this and say if we enter kings in our opponent's range. So the king of hearts is already on the board, so I'll just say king of diamonds and king of clubs. If we put that into our opponent's range and select check, and we check and then have our opponent bet, you're seeing here that we would still be raising at some frequency, we would still be calling at some frequency, when If we really truly know that our opponent had top set, it would ultimately, we would be folding a lot in this hand. But, really, we're not going to necessarily be doing that. All this is essentially doing is taking these specific combinations out of our opponent's range, or any combinations that include these two cards out of our opponent's range, and it just really ultimately just changes the overall weighting and overall frequencies of our range here in this spot here too. So again, it's good to get a sense as to how certain cards might change the overall composition of your opponent's range if your opponent actually held them. So sometimes this might be useful, but I actually don't necessarily use this really that much for analysis, but the option is there. And if you really wanted to just pick a combination, you can click that pick button and you can select a hand that way as opposed to typing it into the screen. It also, I'll go back to the root node, it also has this little section here about frequency across runouts. This gives you a sense as to how often you reach this particular node. So when we started this at the root here, we see this spot happen 100% of the time, and that's going to happen all the time. We also know that we check virtually 100% of the time and bet almost 0% of the time. So if we click check and get to the next node, we can see that we get to this part of the game tree 99.9% of the time. If we click here, bet 36% here, so that the large bet, and I select that, we can see we get to this part of the line 17.33% of the time. And let's say if our opponent raises here, that only happens just under 7% of the time, so our opponent raises. Well, now we get to this part of the game tree only 1.1% of the time. And we can continue working our way through the game tree, each node being reached at a lesser frequency throughout. But it gives us a good sense of really how frequently that portion of the game tree comes up. Which also gives us a sense for how much we should potentially be studying a particular spot or a particular node in the game tree. It also, kind of gives you some insight into maybe, where we want to take our opponent into places of the game tree where they may not be comfortable or familiar. Well, a good place to go in that situation there is a spot where we might not necessarily reach that spot very frequently through normal gameplay here too. So I'll go back to the root node again, and we'll shift down a little bit further here to this section here, which I'm going to call kind of this macro level range section. And the bulk of what we can do is in this macro level range section. Because I do believe in a top-down approach, I think starting at the highest level and working our way into more detail is a really good tactic to take. This is actually where I recommend that you start most of your solver analyses. And what I can first see in this section is essentially a breakdown of our strategic choices at this particular chosen node. The information is displayed rather simply. The player at the root node has the option to bet, sometimes multiple sizes if we've given it multiple sizes, or check. And it will visually show proportionally here by shading the amount that we bet versus the amount that we check. We can also see the data that's broken down into the number of combinations and the percent of each section. So at the root node here, our out of position player is betting virtually 0 combos and checking virtually all of the combos. So the data is really not that interesting, but if we check, we can see the in position player here is at equilibrium, betting the larger 2/3 pot bet sizings with 83 combos in range, which ends up being 17.36% of range. It's betting the 1/3 pot sizing, 18 in this situation here, with 313 combos, which is about 65.38% of range. And then it's checking with 82.7 combos, which is about 17.26% of range. So, again, this data is displayed rather simply, and we can see this proportionally here. This shading here represents the 17%. This lighter shading here represents 65.8%. And this green shading here represents the 17.26% of range. And we can add any number of bet sizes to this, and the idea will really be the same here. We can also go to a future node, and as we change nodes, the specific strategic actions will change, but the overall idea will not. It will always display all of the strategic options at an overall range level and break down the number of combinations that are bucketed in each strategic decision, as well as what percent that group of combinations makes up of your overall range. So before I go into the buttons right below this, I'd actually want to kind of shift back over to this left-hand side of the screen and look at the viewer, because as I start clicking some of these buttons, we're going to start seeing the viewer populate. As I demonstrated in the input section, this is the 13 by 13 grid that defines a player's range, and it's used a lot when analyzing outputs, because while ranges are an input, the strategic frequencies that are associated with all of the individual combinations and hands within a range is an output of a lot of solves too. That's what we're trying to find out, is how frequently at equilibrium the solver is taking certain actions with the entire range, with individual portions of range, with combinations, with hands, etc. So through various data visualization techniques, this section here will show information about the composition of each player's range and some of the corresponding metrics that are associated with the solver output, depending on the options that we select in these buttons here on the right-hand side of the screen. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this course looking at data outputs within this section, and as I mentioned, the specific metric breakdown that's displayed here in the viewer will depend on what's actually selected, over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So depending on what options I select, as you'll see, each of these boxes here, or each of the 169 boxes in this grid, can be shaded, and the data will be populated in different ways based on the options that we select here on the right-hand side of the screen. The other corresponding view of this is this combination section here in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. If we look in the bottom right, we can see this further breakdown. And when I hover over a particular combination, so I'll hover over ace deuce suited here and kind of work my way down, you can see all of the individual combinations of that hand that are broken down in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. This is where we can get down to the most level of granularity, getting down to this very detailed level of analysis, taking into account the very specific individual suits that make up the overall hands that we have and the combinations within those hands that we have. As I mentioned, there are 1,326 total combinations of hands. The way that's broken up for all of our pocket pairs, there are 6 different possible ways in which we can make pocket pairs. Every pocket pair has 6 different ways in which we can make that particular pocket pair. So overall, we have 78 different combinations, which is 6 times the 13 pocket pairs of overall pocket pair hands. For the suited hands, each suited hand obviously can turn into 4 combinations. So there are 4 suits, which means there are 4 ways we can make a suited hand. Of the 78 boxes here in this grid, there are 4 suited hands for each of those boxes, which gives us a total of 312 of these suited hands in the grid here. And then finally, the remaining hands here, so the remaining 78 hands, there are 12 different ways in which we can make offsuit hands. So by adding all of those up, that comes out to our 1,326 total combination hands. So, but I wanted to kind of touch on this and kind of think back to module 1, because we can kind of start here at the highest level and look at things at the range. We can work our way down and drill into the individual hands that make up that range. And if we want to, we can drill even further down into the individual combinations that make up the individual hands. And later in this module, I'm actually going to open up the Range Explorer and introduce hand classes, which is going to give us that kind of intermediary level of aggregation that I introduced in module 1 as well. So there can be multiple levels of analyses that we do and execute depending on what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish. And this is where a lot of the in-app analysis takes place within Pio. But now that you have a sense for the browser interface, I'd like to shift back over here to the buttons above to show how we can display various metrics and data points across each of these different views. So the first thing I want to cover here in this section is this first button here is the clone functionality, which there's the full and the zoom. So I'll click the full one first, and that's just going to open up another window of really the same thing that you're looking at in the browser, in the viewer. The cool thing is that you can navigate to other parts of the game tree on the main viewer. So suppose I want to go back to the root node, and we'll We'll go back to there. I went back to the root node on the main browser, but the clone is showing me where I was when I first cloned this, which was the node after we initially checked. So maybe I want to look at a betting range against a particular calling range just to start building a turn strategy. And that's going to help me look at multiple streets or multiple nodes at the same time to do just some comparative analysis while I'm actually working with two various sets of ranges. There's also this zoom functionality, which does the same thing as the full, but it now zooms in on a particular combination. So the combination that I have selected here is this king deuce suited. The zoom just zooms into that one particular combo. This one's a little tricky. I don't necessarily use it as much, but you can control your combination now that you're looking at here on this screen here, while the zoom will zoom into one particular combination of anything that you're actually selecting here too. Next thing is the range functionality. So when I select one of these buttons, what you're going to see some information here start to pop up. And what that's going to do is show the current range of that selected player. Let's go back to our root node, and I want to select the out of position range. So once I click this, now all of a sudden we have some information on this screen, and you can see the screen starts populating, which is pretty cool. I can also select the in position player's range here. So the out of position player, we obviously know, is taking at the root node here, has this big blind defense range, which is devoid of some of the top end combinations in the range. The in position player's range is fairly linear here. This is our raised first in range for this particular scenario. It's our pre-flop ranges, since nothing in the hand has actually happened yet, right? So I can go back and forth and look at these two ranges, and as I work my way through the tree, you're going to see some of these ranges are going to start condensing somewhat, because we're going to shed some of these hands in our range as we kind of filter down into different parts of the game tree. But you can look at any node here throughout the game tree, and it's always going to show the current range composition at that selected node in the viewer. You can also see the text that appears right here, which shows us the number of combinations that we have and the percent of our overall range. So, in this situation here at the root node, our in position player has almost 480 combos, so 479.4 combinations, and that makes up about 40.76% of his or her overall range. And in the left window here, we can see the visual of the range. So, just as in the range building, we have numbers that range from 0 to 1. 0 represents that hand or combination is not in the range. 1 represents that it is always in the range. And you can think of this in percentage terms, right? So 1 represents 100% of the time and 100% of the combos are in that range. 0 is 0%, and then anywhere in between is somewhat of a mix. There are sometimes that hand is in that range, but not all the time. So 10-8 offsuit here, 64.4% of the time, 10-8 offsuit is in that range, whereas the remainder of the time, so the 35.56% of the time, it is not in that range. It's really helpful, this screen here, when you're counting combinations and you're trying to do the math to figure out things like bluff catcher spots or bet sizings. Understanding the number of combinations here can be helpful with those regards. And that's, when profiling an opponent, it can also be thought of as like a probability if that hand is in their range. We're not great as humans as really estimating probabilities, but starting to think about things in these terms are really going to help you set up some pretty good solves down the road. Next button here is the equity button. So the equity button is going to show the equity of the selected player's range at that particular decision node. And just like with the range, I can click between in position and out of position. So I can go to the equity here of the out of position player. And again, you're going to see here on this left side of the box, the overall equity of the out of position player's entire range. But I can also then go to the individual hands within the range, and actually you can even see as I hover over the individual hands and look in the combination boxes, I can see the equities of the individual combinations. All of these equities are the equities of that particular thing that I'm looking at versus the entire range of your opponent. So the way to read King 5 suited here is King 5 suited for the big blind defense here has 86.85% equity against the entire range that the opener might have, this hijack opening range might have. Sorry, this is a button open range, excuse me. And when we look at the individual combinations, so the combinations of King 5 of spades has 86.48% equity, whereas the combination of King 5 of diamonds has 87.219% equity. So all of these, again, are the equities of that individual hand or that individual combination, whatever the value is in that box against the overarching range. The color weighting is interesting here too. So you can see this scale pop up here, which shows that when the equity is closer to 0, the color tends to be very orange to red. And when the equity is closer to 100%, the color tends to be closer to green, with yellow being in the middle. And you can visually see that throughout this graph. So the green hands represent those where we have a lot of equity. And we obviously know that there are kings on the board because it's fairly green with all the kings. And we can kind of spot the value in this. So some of the two pairs and sets are here, obviously, because they're fairly green. And then these orange hands or the red hands here, we're going to have somewhat worse equity with those particular hands against the opener's range here, this button opening range. You can see here on the flop that you rarely have things on the extremes. So even dryish boards like this, so King 9-5, where there are some gut shots that are available, but there's no flush draws, there's no open-ended straight draws. It's somewhat-ish dry. There's not a lot of hands with above 85 to 90% equity, right? So we have some sets, right, like and some top two pair, which have really high equity. But outside of that, like anything with a king is usually around in the 75-ish% range of equity. So it's fairly we have fairly good equity, but it's not lockdown equity like in a lot of these situations here, even on some of these dry boards. Similarly, we don't tend to have a lot of hands that have much below 15 to 20% equity. Like some of them are in the teens here, but even the worst hands, right, like 3 deuce suited is a pretty bad hand on this board, and we're still sitting with about 16 to 17% equity. Obviously less when we don't have a backdoor flush draw as well too. We're losing a few equity points here as well too. As we get closer and closer to the river, those equities will diverge more and more. So as we get closer and closer to the river, you're going to start seeing some hands move closer and closer to 100% equity, and other hands will move closer and closer to 0% equity. But and we'll look at this a lot. It's a very interesting way to examine range composition. So we'll go through some of these in some of the use case examples later on in the course. Finally here, these last boxes are the expectation value, and the EV buttons operate the exact same way the equity buttons operate. You're often going to see larger discrepancies here, so from the top to the bottom of the scale. As I've mentioned overall, EV is in this scenario here, since I actually don't have any rake accounted for in this scenario, the EVs are going to add up to the pot size. So the out of position EV here is just about 18 chips, 18.63 chips. The in position EV here is 36.37 chips. If I add those two values up, we're going to get our total pot size, which is 55. But when I look at individual hands in range, you're gonna see some much larger variations here, and obviously that's because we're gonna be able to extract much more money with our top end value, and we're really not gonna win the pot very often with our bottom end hands. So even though 3 deuce suited might have 15 to 16% equity, it's gonna under realize its equity extremely often, right? It's going to have a really hard time realizing that equity because it's out of position and it doesn't necessarily have a lot to continue with on this board. It's a disadvantaged board anyways. All examples we'll talk about a lot more in later modules as well too, but again, you're going to see a lot of scenarios where there's a much wider gap between the top end and the bottom end. And you can also see that through the color coding, right? There's a lot more bright reds here and a lot more bright greens. I think this is an awesome and interesting view here. And it's an answer to the question, really, where does the value come from within my range? Notice how all hands have some value, but in some situations, you're going to see that the overwhelming majority of the value of a particular range is driven by a small number of combos.